Welcome back. This is when I really regret not knowing how to whistle. I'd like to whistle and go, shh. There was a whistle. Thank you so much. If you can just settle down so we can save time. Remember today, people are going back, are flying back, those who came in from out of town. So I am going to hand over to Dan Mafura to introduce his panel. Thank you.
Just having some logistical challenges here. Right, no, that's fine. All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the third panel of the day, where we will be speaking about accountability and oversight, the role of Parliament. Now, 2 weeks ago, when addressing the News 24 on the record event in Sandton, the Chief Justice said something very interesting towards the end of his speech. He said, I wonder what would happen if the Guptas were to come back? What would happen if they were to start their enterprise again from the ground? Would Parliament be able to stop them? And then he said, I doubt they would. Now, we know why he has that sentiment, or he holds that sentiment rather, because we know from his report that he found that there was a complete failure of oversight over the executive by Parliament. We know as well that the ANC Parliamentary Caucus in particular comes up prominently in the role that it played to push back against any efforts at inquiring into state capture. We know that the pushback was not only at the level of the National Assembly as a house, but also that it filtered down to the portfolio committees. And we know portfolio committees are important because that's where the bulk of oversight work happens. And this failure of oversight does seem to be quite terminal because we saw as well the complete absence of Parliament from or parliamentary oversight from the government's response to COVID-19. I mean, Parliament was, it was as if we didn't have one. And in more recent times, there have been anxieties and fears expressed about the possibility of an imperial presidency, with the president concentrating or allegedly concentrating a lot of power in his office, centralizing functions in his office. And the question being, should there not be a committee dedicated to the presidency to oversee his functions? So I want to pose a question to the panel today. Is parliamentary oversight possible? And I'm joined, let me just get these bios. I'm joined by Lawson Naidoo, my boss, Executive Secretary of CASAC, who is also the Director of Cricket South Africa. Keeps him very busy, thank God for me. I'm also joined by Marianne Merten, who is an associate editor at Daily Maverick, who has been a prominent writer on Parliament and parliamentary politics. Monique Doyle, who is the head of research, as well as the monitor and projects manager at the Parliamentary Monitoring Group, which is an excellent resource that makes my life a lot easier. And last but not least, Wayne Duvenage, who is the CEO of Outer, and certainly probably not a stranger to anyone in the room. So, Lawson.
Thanks, Dan, and greetings to my fellow panelists. I'm going to be relatively brief because I think there are people on this panel who can deal with some of these issues better than I can. But I just want to sketch a bit of the challenge that we face with Parliament. And I think, we discussed some of this yesterday in relation to procurement and other issues, is that we must bear in mind that the focus of the Zondo Commission was limited to its terms of reference, which was really focusing about parliamentary oversight. CASAC made a detailed submission to Zondo. I gave testimony to Zondo. And I'm pleased that some of the things we said in our submission, he's actually agreed with and incorporated into his report. But I'm not really going to focus on that because I think there's a bigger problem that we have with Parliament, a much bigger problem. We've seen recent disruptions of parliamentary proceedings by MPs attracting much media attention once again. We focus on the ugly spectacle that is being played out before the nation, and it's happened on regular occasions. Criminal complaints have been filed by the MPs who were evicted from the Assembly, as well as by Parliament's protection staff who alleged that they were assaulted by those very MPs. But these are no ordinary skirmishes and violent encounters. They took place in Parliament, albeit in its temporary home, the Good Hope Chamber. Parliament was, in terms of our constitution, designed as the citadel of our constitutional democracy, where the elected representatives of the people gather to debate issues of national importance, craft policies and laws to realize the vision of the Constitution, and yes, to hold the executive arm of the state to account. We place our trust and faith in those elected representatives to act in the national interest and conduct themselves in a manner consistent with their oaths of office. In return for them taking on these tasks and responsibilities, we, the people, we reward them handsomely with salaries and perks that most South Africans can only dream of. Yet they have collectively and consistently, certainly in recent years, let us down. The conduct that we see in the National Assembly undermines the very democratic practices that our Constitution seeks to espouse, rendering the institution almost dysfunctional. You've got to ask yourself, how is this behavior any different to someone trying to burn down the very building itself? It is destroying that very infrastructure, and it happens across the board. I want to quote from, get to the right place. From the state capture report, and where it says that President Ramaphosa, testifying in his capacity as the president of the ANC and the former deputy president of the ANC, accepted the proposition that where there is information in the public domain, which if true would implicate a president in conduct which is allegedly unconstitutional, illegal, or improper, the National Assembly is obliged to do what it can, firstly, to establish whether there is any merit in the allegations, and secondly, if it finds that there is, to take appropriate action. President Ramaphosa accepted that proposition, and yet it was not borne out by his own conduct in refusing to answer questions on Phala Phala in Parliament a few weeks ago. So these are some of the issues that I think that are much deeper, go much deeper than what's in the Zondo report. And yes, there are recommendations, as Dan has said, about establishing a parliamentary committee with oversight over the president and the presidency. There are recommendations about, strengthening the powers and authority of committees. And yet in his report, he makes clear that Parliament and its committees were imbued with the necessary powers in order to investigate state capture. They simply chose to turn a blind eye. And that's something that is part of our political culture, unfortunately. And, strengthening the rules of the National Assembly, maybe even legislation, may assist, but it's no guarantee. And I think this is why the Chief Justice posed the question that Dan referred to. The rhetorical question, would Parliament act any differently now if the Guptas were still here and state capture was happening? And I think recent experience of parliaments tells us that that wouldn't necessarily be the case. So I just want to maybe just pause on one aspect of the recommendations of the Chief Justice in relation to Parliament, one or two. And I think the critical one for me is, and it's very much an issue that is in the forefront or ought to be in the forefront of public debate right now, and that is about amending the electoral system. Because I think we're not going to change the culture of Parliament unless we change the electoral system itself. So everything else that's in the report for me, would be meaningless unless we have that fundamental debate about the kind of electoral system that is going to require greater accountability, that is going to require members of Parliament to actually respect the oaths of office that they take. And the Chief Justice in his report has said, and he supported the view of moving towards some kind of constituency-based electoral system. He's expressed a view for the majority view in the Van-Zyl-Slabbert report in terms of multi-member constituencies, but he hasn't ruled out the notion of a single-member constituencies either. And I think given that Parliament is currently dealing with the New Nation Movement judgment in terms of its proposals to amend the Electoral Act, these factors need to come to the fore. And there's been a consistent call from the time of the Van-Zyl-Slabbert report, the independent panel assessment on Parliament in 2008 or 9, the Motlanthe high-level panel in 2017, now the Zondo report, Minister Motsoaledi's own ministerial advisory committee, that have all suggested that we must move towards some kind of constituency-based model, whether it's a single-member constituency or a multi-member constituency, and yet Parliament resolutely refuses to engage on that and is stubbornly persisting with allowing independent candidates only to contest within the current ambit of the list system. So I think that's a fundamental issue that as a country we need to challenge, because as I say, many of these other things, as laudable as they are, including the issue of saying, well, Parliament should consider appointing opposition MPs as chairs of committees. The ANC would still have its majority on the committee, but to do that. Secondly, this practice that was in Parliament for a long time, from 94 until, I think, if I'm not mistaken, 2014, and Monique will correct me if I'm wrong, where there was always a member of an opposition party as part of the presidium of presiding officers, not necessarily as the deputy speaker, but as a chair of committees or some. So it gave a semblance. And, the Constitution speaks of Parliament as a multi-party organ. And yet what we've seen in recent years is not that. The ANC, laying claim to every position within Parliament. So the public and opposition parties don't feel that they're being treated properly by Parliament, and that's why we see the levels of dysfunction that we do. So I think I'm going to stop now, because I don't want to go into the detail of what Zondo said, because I think we can discuss that and talk about the recommendations in the Corder report and all of that, which was all in CASAC submission as well. So I support those, but my sense is if we don't deal with the bigger picture, none of this is actually going to make for any meaningful change. Thanks.
Thank you, Lawson. Marianne?
Oh, okay, we're going down this way. Great. Let me try and do my diligence here, and I've just decided my notes have gone into the dustbin. I'm picking up for where Lawson has left off, because the point that he's making is absolutely fundamental, and it talks to the point that Mr. Ali raised earlier in a different context. It talks to what Terence Nombembe talked about yesterday, and also Kenneth Brown yesterday. It is that crucial moment, and that moment comes, and well, we'll all pay the price. And it is at that tipping point. And yes, I do not want to overuse Zwelinzima Vavi's "here's the tsunami." So we are at the tipping point, rather. Part and parcel of that is precisely two things: December elective conference and 2024. And if anybody thinks that the electioneering for both the elective political party conference and 2024 is not already underway, please think again and please have a look at some of the sessions in the House. You will find the broad outlines of the political strategy emerging there. The DA on that side of the House will say how fabulous they're doing, and, you know, they can spin Cape Town track record, plus the track record in various other municipalities. The EFF will do what they're good at, the spectacle of politics, throwing their bodies on the line for democracy against a criminal president, point two. You have the ANC coming out a little bit more sophisticated, but none less acerbic. And the strategy depends on the day, it depends on who's speaking. The DA is always racist, elitist, only interested in maintaining apartheid rule, spatial segregation of townships versus everything else. On another day, especially if the Justice Minister, Ronald Lamola, who has not yet quite forgotten the ANC Youth League politics of the Malema era, takes a dig at the EFF, and then we are talking fascist, populist, little dictators, etc. So that is what Parliament has begun. And yes, Lawson is absolutely right. What is supposed to have been in the Constitution, the Premier House for Assembly, for national debate discussions, all of that has completely gone out of the window. It is part and parcel of the toxic politics of South Africa. Tandega, you also mentioned that today. And I don't want to undermine or diss anything, but unless certainly solving it overnight or even within the next few years is going to not happen. But unless that becomes a permanent fixture in all thinking about solutions and what to do, a lot of the very, very cool ideas that have been debated and that have come from the floors in the last day and a half will not work and will be put aside and floundered, whether that's a whistleblower protection bill that is in the making, whether that's the procurement legislation that is to be changed, whether that is the electoral amendment bill, which basically is just about ready to go to the House for a vote. So if anybody wants to change it, it's late. The only thing that will change it, like the traditional courts bill that has been approved by Parliament and literally just awaits the President's signature, are court challenges. And those are things that I'm a little reluctant to suggest, because I always, I'm a bit of furniture in Parliament. I've been there for a while. So I really kind of am in love with the potential that a hip and happening national legislature could have, and should have. And our courts have repeatedly upheld the fundamental role of Parliament as the expression of the people in a number of judgments. Never mind the 2016 Nkandla judgment, but also the 2017 UDM secret ballot case, where the Constitutional Court made it absolutely clear that MPs of whatever party swear an oath of office to uphold, to obey the law of the Republic and the Constitution. And if there is a conflict between that and our electoral system, that constitutional judgment is fundamentally crucial. It says the oath of office takes precedence. For the last 5 years, that has not happened. And when Cyril Ramaphosa, as president of the ANC, appeared before Zondo, it was repeated about party discipline, about, well, we did something, we were a bit slow, and then the law enforcement track didn't kind of happen, so we switched to the parliamentary track, and then we saw action. We were a bit late, 6 years, 2011 to 2017 June. I think maybe Gwede Mantashe was even more blunt about it, talking about Parliament has no free riders. You don't come with your own jacket. You do, quote unquote, you do what the party tells you. And this is the national chairperson who testified before Chief Justice Raymond Zondo, who had previously led the ANC as Secretary General for two terms, so to speak. So that gives you an understanding of the background and the context and the situation against which the politics unfold, against which we have what we see in Parliament and which has been so fundamentally breaking and bruising of Parliament. Unless that changes, whatever the Zondo Commission report suggests, whatever anyone else will suggest, runs the risk of being ignored. Now, Parliament, the one thing that is really, really nice about Parliament for those who want to misuse it, for want of a better expression, is that there's a whole bunch of protocol and parliamentary process niceties. So you can do a whole bunch of things that makes it look like you're doing something when actually you're not doing anything at all. So a lot of the things like, for example, some of the reports that the national anti-corruption strategy, for example, would be an example. Now that in this forum, people don't know where to put them in Parliament. So there's a process. So the process is a minister, whoever steers things through, or a Chapter 9 head, sends it to the Speaker's office with a request to refer or to table it to a committee. Unless that's done, the committees and the culture in the committees that has settled in, I would say over the last 10, 15 years even, is that, well, it's not before us, we're not going to do this. We can't just take anything that's in the public mind. I mean, we're Parliament, we're MPs, we make laws. We can't just take anything that people are discussing over coffee and spend our time on. That's the attitude. And let me be blunt. There are some committee chairpersons who see themselves as chairpersons of boardroom meetings. So there's an agenda that's adopted. There are the welcoming remarks. Then you hand over to whatever delegation there is to make their welcoming remarks. Then there is the PowerPoint presentation that has been with the MPs for 7 days. There's a whole section of Parliament that pre-choose these PowerPoint presentations for MPs. And before COVID and remote and virtual, I promise you those MPs were given folders with color-coded tabs on the side with summaries of those PowerPoint presentations. That's it. And then the strategy, of course, is that you have questions all at the end, all together. So suddenly you've got 2 hours of questions. And you know, the ministers go says, the DG go says, cool. I answer that question, I answer that question. And unless the chairperson is sharp, they will pick and choose what to answer. And that is called oversight. And you know what? Strictly speaking, on a technical, narrow reading of the rules, it is indeed oversight. Qualitatively, it's nothing but a show. And I've covered Parliament since like a long time ago. And I'm thinking, how does one fix it? How does one change it? And it requires, and this is a platform, and requires a multiple intervention. PMG is absolutely fantastic for keeping records that actually Parliament should be keeping, but doesn't. Parliament can't even keep publishing Hansard. It has not published a complete Hansard in book form for the last 10 years. You get them online, but it's called the unrevised Hansard. So that's slightly different. So solutions. The solutions are where I started off, and I think also where I picked up from Lawson, is that please, whatever you do as civil society, please be aware of those games. Be aware that, you know what, you need to insist, you need to understand the parliamentary processes, you need to call the MPs out. It's your right when you make a presentation in Parliament to say, Chairperson, actually, I think I would like to ask to have a one-on-one question answer. I think that would be better for me. Can we do it? If that does not work for the honourables, can we maybe limit it to 3 questions at a time? We want to have a quality engagement. It's those things that, you know what, just throw things. Work with the chairperson. If you have a report that you want to bring to the attention, go through the officials' channels, go through the Speaker's office. The Speaker office might just slide it in for for noting, which basically means the committees won't schedule it. So communicate with the chairperson, get it up there and say, we're prepared to come, schedule us. And you know what? There's still a little core of parliamentary journalists left. Give us a call and say, listen, we've been trying to get here and they're not letting us in. Yes. Also, if you are doing anything, please, public hearings, the electoral law amendment has shown how political parties massage the process. If you have something, please just submit. And if you have the money, facilitate other people coming online and making submissions, NGOs, civil society organizations, so that there is a little bit more of a spread rather than all 4 big companies saying that, well, actually, you know, we really can't afford to pay that carbon tax at this rate. Can you make it a little bit lower? And not offering to put anything else on the table. Anything else? I think I've gone about 3 minutes over. I apologize. Up for questions afterwards.
Thank you so much. Monique? I don't know if you can.
Hi, everyone. And thank you to the organizers for inviting PMG. This is not our natural role. We're at the back of the room, just taking notes and observing. But I think it's important for those who have a voice to speak when the opportunity arises. So Lawson and Marianne have done very well at looking at the big picture issues. And I'm not that experienced of a panelist to just simply neglect my notes. So I'm going to try to weave it in somehow and maybe look at some of the details as to why oversight failed. The big issues are big issues for a reason. And maybe to reform Parliament, we actually need to look at the small things and how that can maybe be brought about as a wave to bring about bigger reforms in Parliament. So PMG recently wrote a piece on ineffective oversight in light of the release of the final Zondo report. And we looked at the various practical mechanisms through which oversight is carried out. And we found that in many ways, Zondo cemented what commentators in civil society have pointed out before, namely that Parliament is ineffective, executive accountability is lacking, and the institution simply does not inspire confidence. The failure of Parliament in state capture is not the first time Parliament's failed us. Look at the arms deal, we look at the Nkandla report and other examples to see how the legislature gets things wrong. So in many ways, the Zondo report outlines deep and perpetual problems that have existed since the start of our democratic era, essentially. And so at the heart of it, PMG finds that effective oversight and accountability rests on 2 fundamental requirements. It's both institutional strength and political will. But overridingly, individual members of Parliament and political leaders must display that they are willing to use the oversight tools at their disposal effectively. But something that Lawson touched on that's very important is political culture. And so Zondo report sharply displayed Parliament's unwillingness to act on the allegations of state capture, even when there were 4 committees that were given a directive to specifically act. So the Zondo Commission also writes at length about how party politics plays itself out. And yeah, I don't need to go into the details of that. We know that MPs owe their seats to their parties, and that it's very difficult for an MP to act independently when they have that party mandate that is an albatross around their neck. But really, the balance, the Zondo report also showed the balance of powers in the caucus and how this sways matters in effective oversight, but surely oversight cannot be left to the whims of a balance in the party. And so something else I also want to say about the general political culture of Parliament is, as Lawson said, it's the embodiment of a multi-party democracy. But currently, one-party dominance is being used to frustrate debate and the efforts of the opposition to play their role. And the opposition is a necessary component to an effective oversight and effective democracy. And so that, that can't be ignored. And something else that Marianne touched on that I just want to add to in more detail is the role of the chairperson and how critical that is to effective oversight, and maybe it shouldn't be as critical as it is. So in our analysis, corroborated by Zondo, we find that committee chairpersons are extremely influential in setting the tone for how robust oversight will be and determining the extent to which the committee succeeds or fails in its oversight mandate. And so, given that committees are the primary terrain for effective oversight, the role of the chair is critical. There have been a minority of cases where a genuine attempt was shown to effect accountability, and that has largely been because of the role of the chair. For example, we look at Zukiswa Ranto and the effective role that she played and how her reward for standing up against corruption was to be removed from the party list at the next election, while those gravely implicated by evidence given at the commission have been rewarded as chairs and currently sit as chairs now. So while Zondo recommends that more opposition chairs should be used to counteract some of the dynamics I've just described, at the same time, it's about the political culture that exists in Parliament. And so even if we did have a chair from the ruling party, if that chair could show the leadership and set the tone for an independence in the committee, then it doesn't really matter which party the chairperson comes from. And also as PMG, we also wanted to speak specifically to the committee system of Parliament. And while the legislature has a toolkit of oversight mechanisms, Zondo has confirmed that the committee system remains the primary forum for meaningful oversight. But Marianne has done well to explain how committees are usually ineffective. And there are glaring shortcomings in the committee system that impedes meaningful oversight. Too often, committee meetings are dominated by lengthy presentations and not enough time is left for robust discussion. So it's a case of form over substance. The question and answer style is clumsy and lacks direct dialogue, and it's through that dialogue that we would have robust discussion. And something else that Zondo said is that Parliament, and by extension its committees, set the tone for how they want to be treated. And at the moment, Parliament really defers to the executive, as you've outlined with the National Coronavirus Command Council. So, yeah, that's, yeah. And then it was interesting to note that the Zondo Commission made a number of findings of small institutional weaknesses that we might not have expected the Commission to make recommendations about, but the fact that they do shows the importance. Marianne mentioned the lack of follow-through in tabled committee reports, that Parliament doesn't track these committee reports, which is totally bizarre. And then the fact that these committee reports should serve as more than just evidence that oversight has taken place. And so for the oversight to be effective, the recommendations must be acted on. At the moment, oversight is a tick box exercise. Yeah. And then just to go to my, just in summary, some of the reforms that we wanted to add to Parliament really needs to identify the major gaps that exist, giving rise to weak oversight. Lawson spoke about giving flesh to the constitutional skeleton and the need for accountability legislation. The Quarter report speaks about the Accountability Standards Act. We strongly urge that Parliament direct each committee to engage with the Zondo report through colloquiums or workshops, which can be convened with the relevant stakeholders, because portfolio committees lie at the heart of why Parliament dropped the ball on state capture. We also strongly recommend that this is the ideal time to reimagine the committee system for effective oversight. There's nothing stopping committees from tapping into expert information from civil society, working with the media to reinforce the information that they use when conducting oversights. Committees should build relationships with civil society because civil society really has the strength to enhance the capacity and efficacy of Parliament. So it's prudent to remind ourselves at this point that state capture is principally a product of institutional deficiencies and systemic failure. At the Zondo report highlighted these critical deficiencies in Parliament. And while we should acknowledge that Parliament has made reforms to its rules and mechanisms over the years, where it matters most, the institution has failed. And so in response to the Zondo Commission, Parliament must prove that it's not reactive, that it's still relevant, and it is an independent arm of the state. And to do this, it urgently needs to implement the recommendations of the Zondo Commission. We really hope that it's a watershed moment for the institution, but how they implement the recommendations will prove that. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Monique. Thanks. Wayne?
Well done to Perry, KSAC, great conference. And thanks for the invitation. So, look, the Zondo report has really encapsulated and captured everything that we already knew. And the recommendations are fantastic, but it is so sad that we had to go through listening to what journalism, credible journalism, civil society organizations had already put out there. And Parliament is not blind and not deaf to all of those reports. If you just go back to 2009 when Jacob Zuma had entered office, and Mandy Balfour, the journalist of Mail and Guardian, I think at the time, had exposed the 69 million rand issue at Nkandla, which over the next few years grew to 250 million rand. What we saw was a spectacle, just a debacle of how Parliament set out and its members to defend its president and its henchmen, turning a swimming pool into a fire pool. And we literally became the laughing stock of the world as our Parliament tried to defend and uphold this is normal, this is okay, and we shouldn't be putting our president under pressure. And this is the type of abuse of power that is absolutely gross. And so we start to ask ourselves, what is it about Parliament that it isn't engaging with civil society? You know, I recall in 2012 when we could see what was so wrong with this ETOL decision, and it was one that was forced through into being. And no matter where we went, whether it was ministerial advisory committees, nobody wanted to listen. And when we finally got an audience, and it was very tough to have an audience with the Transport Portfolio Committee in Parliament, it was abusive. You know, here was an organization that was showing government what was going to happen, the research that we'd done, and why government suffers this crisis of legitimacy because it cannot manage its own laws. But it wouldn't listen. It wouldn't respond to questions we asked. And we were left packing, and so you have to turn to civil disobedience campaign to get the message across, which is not really what you want to do. Whether that happened then and became the catalyst to the end of a very bad, costly decision that was fraught with corruption, it would have happened anyway. It didn't take an arter or need an arter to demise a scheme that was born in sin. And so we see this repeatedly, even leading up to the last vote of no confidence in Jacob Zuma in Parliament, where the Gupta leaks had already come out. So now all the speculation that they'd put the media reports prior to that to was evidential stuff, but they kept looking away. And we and we compiled a no room to hide, a President Court in the Act document, which we gave to every parliamentarian in the preparation for that vote, hoping that their conscience would be stroked. But obviously it never was going to be. So the answer that we have to this question of, could state capture happen today? Absolutely. And it comes down to what my fellow panelists have been speaking about, and that is that we have an electoral system that is grossly flawed, that political parties in the back rooms and corridors of their headquarters decide on who's going to represent you and I in Parliament. We have no say. And unless there is meaningful electoral reform, we will continue to have this problem. And Parliament right now has done everything they can to kick this can down the road. The 2-year deadline given by the Constitutional Court in June has come and gone. They've got another 6-month extension, and they're not doing anything meaningful about this. And what they want to do is get past that 2024 gate again, so they have another 5 years of making sure that the people that represent us, or supposedly represent us in Parliament, actually represent the political masters. And that's the sad reality we have, that we're going to sit with unless we force this issue. Tomorrow there's a protest action outside Parliament. And I think we, as civil society, as citizens, and business, and by the way, business has been missing in action. It is not doing enough to defend our democracy. It is looking away, and it is on the other side of the corruption coin where government writes the checks is business receiving that money. And far too often we see them looking away. Every single day, I know Corruption Watch, ourselves and others are getting momentous cases that we just cannot get to of corruption that's probably more endemic today than it was 5 years ago. It's a serious problem. And literally every deal, every procurement process that is undertaken happens in the space of how many middlemen can suck off and eat a slice out of that pie. It doesn't help if Parliament's just going to keep looking away, if Parliament is going to defend the nefarious activities that have taken place and not ask the tough questions. We don't need commissions of inquiries to tell Parliament what's wrong. They know what's wrong. What we need is Parliament to open the door and to get involved with civil society. And if they don't open the door, what we now need is civil society to kick that door down. We need them to feel every pressure point that is out there, that is possible, for them to know that they're doing wrong. The Zondo Commission tells them very clearly, it is a lot of recommendations, but I don't think they're going to be bothered to implement those recommendations. When the Zondo Commission talks about its recommendations of having to introduce laws to highlight and get parliamentarians to understand how to introduce oversight and accountability, and it's crazy. It's not a foreign term, accountability. We know what we have to do to hold people accountable. So these powerful engine rooms within Parliament, these parliamentary portfolio committees, are just merely occupied by the same stooges that are put in those positions by the political elite. And the slap in the face came in 2019 when Cyril Ramaphosa, on the ticket of an anti-corruption journey, allowed the situation where Mosebenzi Zwane and Faith Matambi and Batabi Litlamini and Jermat Peterson to be chairpersons of these very portfolios that are supposed to fight and ask the tough questions and set the scene, as you say, Dominique, for the robust discussion. I was in one of the parliamentarian sessions one day where somebody was saying, what should be in this committee right now are the hawks sitting here because we're about to question some serious wrongdoing that is taking place in a state-owned entity, where are the hawks? Where are the people, the criminal justice people? Why aren't they in the room at the parliamentary portfolio committees, taking notes, getting the evidence, and literally arresting the executives that would walk out of that parliament committee meeting that afternoon? That's what we need. That's what we want. But we will not get that unless we have meaningful electoral reform, unless we have, instead of, we don't know who's going to sit and be elected at the next elections. This constituency-based electioneering makes a lot of sense. And imagine if the ANC or the EFF have to put up a Jumat Peterson and a Mosebenzi Zwane against upstanding members of society, and society can now choose who's going to represent them in that constituency. I can guarantee you none of those 4 people that I mentioned and hundreds of others would be able to become members of parliament, because the public would have a stronger say. So I just say we need to drive this agenda of electoral reform. We must not let, by the end of December, our parliament get away with hijacking this country for another 5 years, because if they do, we are in serious, serious trouble. We as civil society must start kicking those doors down. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for a very insightful conversation. Certainly paints a very bleak picture of the state of our national legislature. We have a few minutes before we have to break for lunch, so I'm going to take 2 questions from the floor. I see you, David, and you too, and then we're going to turn to Devi to see if we have any questions online, and then we can come back to the floor. Thank you.
You know, whenever anything is said about the deficiency of Parliament, you talk about reforming the rules of Parliament, or is there no possibility of regulating political parties? I know that that's not done often. I mean, but they're treated as though they were tennis clubs, voluntary associations, when in fact their influence, well, I don't need to say, but their influence over all of us is huge. And what about regulating them? I mean, even down to just requiring them to hold a certain number of meetings a year, like companies are, and publish minutes, for example, of their meetings. I mean, you know, if the pundits are right, and after 2024, we have a series of coalition governments, probably even at the national level, and the parties continue to behave as they are behaving in the current coalitions, we're in for serious instability. You know, look at what is happening in Johannesburg, and there's some cause for comfort there in the fact that the smaller parties, the leadership of the smaller parties, have admitted that their representatives in the city council were bribed. I mean, the only one that hasn't admitted it is the EFF, which, I mean, makes you wonder maybe what the source of the bribes were. But should there not be a conversation about regulating political parties? The only thing that is regulated is funding, but there are plenty of loopholes there, although that has already borne fruit. I mean, it's kind of interesting to know that the ANC's single donation came from a Russian oligarch when you see what position they've taken on the Ukraine-Russia war. And it's kind of interesting to know that all the DA's money, in effect, comes from the Oppenheimers, and maybe not surprising. They've at least been consistent in that. But I really repeat, is there no way of thinking about regulating political parties to ensure that the Zwanes and Jumat Petersons can't represent a political party, even if the political party wants them to represent them? And we're not alone in this. I mean, I think I saw a recent figure that said in India, 80% of parliamentarians have a criminal record. You know, so we're not alone in this problem. But in that problem lies the decline of liberal democracy, actually.
Thank you. Next question, this side.
Okay. Hi, Gabby again from OpenUp. It's not a question so much as a common lament. And I think, it's also painful to see, for instance, that PMG continues to do work while unfunded by Parliament, which to me seems a bit crazy. But I think linking to the conversation earlier about whistleblowers, in my experience in dealing with whistleblower legislation in Parliament, one of the things that all the political parties seemed fairly consistent on was an across-the-board dismissal of the interests of whistleblowers, except for maybe Advocate Breitenbach in the Justice Committee for very personal reasons. And I mean, you saw that in 2017 when the Protected Disclosures Act got amended to include a criminal offence against whistleblowers who maliciously reported, which was just an insane provision. And to stand there and try and even, push evidence that there's no evidence that there is a frequent, experience of malicious reporting, to point out that if you maliciously report, you're not subject to protection on PDA anyway, and to just have these blank faces staring at you across the board of the parties is an indictment of that process, but also is very much an indication of who parties feel accountable to. And so it has to be a question of electoral reform in the big picture. But I agree that there are little strategies you can use to try and game Parliament as it is. I think parliamentary questions are a fun way to, a lot more fun way of getting some answers than people necessarily think they are. And there's a lot of interesting information in there. But I think also if civil society feels frustrated, I can't imagine what it's like for the Auditor General to constantly go into portfolio committees and, present evidence of, in the Home Affairs, of the harness, nightmare, and then years later, the ABIS nightmare. Can't remember which way it goes, went round, but it's essentially the same kind of corruption, 5 years apart. They must think they're going crazy. So yeah, just to confirm, full sympathies, really.
Thank you. Well received. Devi?
Yes, we have two questions that have come through online. The first is from Tladinyana Kodumo on Zoom. He asks, what role can CBOs and NPOs play to educate the population about the Constitution as well as the new Electoral Act? How can we teach people on the ground to prepare them before the 2024 national elections? People deserve to be taught what democracy means. Then on YouTube, we have a question from Tabisi Moyo asking, what forced parliamentary oversight in the Zuma years was strategic litigation? Would it not be prudent for civil society to force government through the courts again to implement political reforms?
All right. Lawson, you'll take the last one, and then we can just move up.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think, litigation is always a last resort. It's time consuming, it's expensive, and it doesn't all, you may secure a victory in court, but whether that actually, you see that being implemented is another question altogether. And you use the Nkandla case as an example. The Constitutional Court said that Parliament had failed in its constitutional duty to hold the President to account. What has Parliament done to change any of its internal processes to address that serious finding from the Constitutional Court? So I think we've got to acknowledge the limitation of litigation. Yes, it is necessary sometimes, but it must be used sparingly and only when appropriate. On David's question about internal party regulation, I mean, this boils down to the issue of, well, who's going to do it? Ultimately, if it's legislation, it's political parties. And this is the dilemma we face with the electoral reform bill at the moment, because the legislative process is left to political parties. And there's probably, so in addition to internal party regulation, there's the electoral reform process. And then, amazingly, we actually got the Political Party Funding Act passed. by the very political parties regulating themselves. But there's a sense of buyer's remorse at the moment because the ANC are making noises about wanting to amend the bill because of the financial difficulties they're facing. So it's difficult to get those role players who are inherently conflicted in all of these areas to actually deal with what needs to be done. And then just the couple of other points I want to make. In terms of electoral reform, I mean, it's critical. And I keep saying it's a necessary but not a sufficient change in our political system. It's not a panacea. Changing the electoral system is not automatically going to make MPs more accountable. Political parties are a feature of our politics, and they're going to be there. And they're going to behave in exactly the same way as they behave at the moment. So therefore, what I said right at the beginning, that we need to shift the political culture, remains critical. Thanks.
I just want to add that, as Lawson just said, it's going to court is expensive and it's time consuming, and civil society doesn't have money. It is funded by various entities, crowd-funded, but it's not an endless pot, and you've got to spend that money very wisely. And the fact that we're in court or got the constitutional judgment 2.5 years ago, almost, on the need for electoral reform is one of those, but you can see where it's going. So it's not always the answer. I think it does come down to culture, this political culture, and it is up to us. And to the question of educating society as to why it's important to vote. What is Parliament all about? It's so sad that this is not a subject in the final years of school as kids are reaching the voting age out there. But government won't want that because it does empower citizens as to what actually should be happening. And they're not going to want that. So it is going to be up to us as civil society, defend our democracy and many institutions to get the message out there and educate the public. If we can just get that voter turnout above the 65 to 70% again, you'll see a very, very different picture out there.
Yeah, just on electoral reform, definitely agree with Lawson that it's not the panacea, but it's likely to help. I know I'm not supposed to ask questions from the panel, but something I think about often is about legislation to protect MPs from losing their seats. Is that something that would assist, and how would that work? No?
We had
all right.
All
right, okay, yeah. And then, yeah, regulating political parties, as Lawson said, political parties are a key feature of our democracy that's unlikely to change. But maybe there's reform in the closed list system, and maybe that needs to end. We should have open lists to know who our potential candidates in Parliament would be. Would that influence how we vote and change that? And then if I can also just take a cheap shot at this point, there is value in PMG and not having Parliament take its own minutes. We are independent, we have value behind what we do. You don't want to know the state of Parliament's minutes. So keep supporting PMG. Thanks.
Absolutely. The state of Parliament's minutes, they drowned in the fire engine water that put out the fire, if they existed. Let me try and answer a couple of things, and let me just follow in everyone's line and say, electoral reform is absolutely crucial. It is not the end of it. And the example I like to make is, remember your ward councillor? Directly elected. Various research shows that ward councillors still kind of pander, service an elite and are not accountable to their communities. It's one of the reasons that I think, 11 years after the smoke that calls, we still find ourselves in a situation that communities feel that they need to protest in order to get attention to all the service delivery failures. So I just want to flag that there. Political parties regulate themselves beautifully. If there's the will, if there's the way. Remember 2010, 2011? Jacob Zuma was hatful of Julius Malema. You know what? The DC was hauled. The whole of the ANC Youth League, Lamola, Shivambu, Malema, DC'd all the way up to the appeal done. Out. Done. No need for a step-aside rule. No need about when does the step-aside rule come in? Does it come in before the charges are? Does it come? None of that is needed. So if there is, and this goes back to the scene setting that we had, if the political culture is toxic, if the political culture is not changed, a lot of the issues with regard to what Chief Justice Raymond Zondo has identified, a lot of the issues around parliamentary accountability will not change. And can I close? Can I go? I wanted to maybe make one last comment to say what I had wanted to start off with. You took the winds out of my sail. I mean, you know, but the Chief Justice's comments are absolutely spot on. And even if it's not the Guptas, if it's somebody else who tries to do the same thing again, the way the system works at the moment, unless the doors are broken down, the setup is such that it will happen again. For me, one of the most painful things is that in 2016, March 31st, when the Constitutional Court in a unanimous judgment said that Parliament, the National Assembly, that's the voice of the poor, the voice of the people, that's supposed to be the debate place of people's ideas, had, quote unquote, acted inconsistent with the Constitution that had been passed in 1996 in that House. It's just heartbreaking. And unfortunately, my maths is really bad. 6 years down the line, 6 years down the line, we are in the same situation. Parliament has not done anything on the Zondo Commission report. It has issued statement to say, we've approached the Rules Committee to tell us how we must process this. It has said that we will deal with it when the President comes and gives us the implementation report. And there was some grumblings and mumblings that we've looked at some of the things and we've decided to look at people that we may have to do something about. Then the legal opinion surfaced that no, Gwede Mantashe will not face anything over Bosasa because he was the ANC Secretary General at the time, not an MP. Tabang Makwetla, the Defense Minister, had already faced an ethics inquiry into that and had repaid everything, so there's double jeopardy in place. No names have ever been mentioned. Vincent Smith, no action will be taken. He's no longer an MP. So Kisa Faku, also no longer an MP. Cedric Frolick, yes. Winnie Ngwenya, yes. But no names were ever mentioned. Nothing came from Parliament to say, we have referred these people to. So on the basis of that legal opinion, we're likely to see maybe Mosebenzi Zwane go before the Ethics Committee, not for what he's done in the Free State asbestos issue, but possibly with regards to Tegeta, because he was a Free State MEC then, but when he came to Tegeta, he was an ANC MP at Parliament, so maybe then. We're still waiting to see what will happen regarding Faith Mutambi, who was Communications Minister at the time at the media breakfast. What we have instead is we have a Parliament that issues a public statement to say it has noted with serious concern, it has noted with concern the comments of the Chief Justice. And the irony of that statement that is available on Parliament's website is that it makes reference to the President submitting the action plan for oversight, and it confines its role with regards to the presidential action plan as oversight arising out of Zondo. We know already that come in the next 5 weeks, that action plan, and we know this courtesy of the Justice Minister, Ronald Lamola, who was addressing Rand Merchant Bank Big Five investment at the Vineyard Hotel in Cape Town on Tuesday, I believe. We know that it will be an all-of-government response with legislative changes and institutional reviews. That's it.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. Yes. Oh, Zuki, so you can come in as well. Can we get the mic?
You. Oh, sorry. Thank you. So I'm Mutlatsi Komote from the Women in Democracy Initiative at the Duvenage Institute, UWC. I just wanted to perhaps provide some answers to those questions, if I may. I think the first thing that we haven't quite adequately spoken about today is the role of public participation in this as well. I think that what we've seen with Parliament definitely is that there are processes in place, but they're very largely inadequate. So even as recently as a couple of weeks ago, there's a Chapter 9 process, appointment process underway. And one of the concerns that civil society organizations had was largely centered around the fact that there was a small time frame, and that's been a consistent concern by civil society organizations. And I think if we can deal with that specifically, that might be one of the starting points. Also, in terms of holding the executive accountable, I think PMG and ourselves, if I may say so cheekily, Monique, sorry to put you in the spotlight, had done some research about a year or two ago on requests for written submissions by the legislature to the executive. And one of the things that was quite interesting to observe was the fact that in some instances, some of the portfolio committees had actually asked for written submissions on their questions due to time constraints during meetings, and there wasn't always follow through with regards to that. And I think in terms of holding the executive accountable, I think it's a challenge to Parliament specifically to have some consistency in terms of how committee chairpersons are allowed to deal with the executive. And then lastly, I think the role of the constituency officers is quite an important one in terms of getting the public to at least engage in parliamentary processes. So I just wanted to note that. And then lastly, around the question of education, I think that we need to also have a discussion around the role of the provincial education officers and Parliament's own education office and how these can be strengthened, in particular through us as civil society organizations, adding our voice consistently. So I just wanted to provide that input in terms of that. But thank you very much for this very important conversation.
Thank you. Mutlatsi, can we have the mic here to the front, please?
Thank you. Hi, my name is Zugi Swakota from the Public Service Accountability Monitor. I'll be very quick with my two questions. The first, and I think the panel was fantastic, really learned a lot, intrigued by a lot. The first question is just, I definitely agree with the point about engaging committees more directly or chairpersons more directly. I'd be very curious though, and perhaps it's a kind of a broader question. One of the limitations for civil society in some instances is the dirty word of lobbying. And that is tied very often to, in many instances, what our funders say we should not do, cannot do. And in the absence of reform in many instances, we may well need to kind of take on some of these things. So I just wanted to figure out what is possible in the interim before we can kind of talk about the kinds of reforms that would be more enabling for us to get work done, to have our reports taken seriously, taken forward, to have chairpersons engage with us more directly. Second quick question. In the time that either of you have engaged in the parliamentary space, would you say there has been an instance in which there has been good, solid, meaningful relationships between key civic actors, CSOs, or particular formations that have informed parliamentary processes or committee processes meaningfully, sustainably, and in a way that's kind of tangible? I'd be curious to see that or hear that.
Thank you. Lawson, you want to take?
Yeah, I mean, I recall, there was one committee chaired by Yunus Karim, I think, the Standing Committee on Finance. And Yunus took the view that anybody that was in the meeting had the right to speak. So it wasn't just MPs. So if you went there as a member of the public, civil society, you would have your turn to speak. Unfortunately, as far as I know, no other committees do that. That was the one example. And then, on the issue of committee chairs, it really does depend on the chair, because with some of them you'll find they're happy to engage and quite accommodating. Others will just send you packing. They're not interested. So that again comes back culture, leadership from the political party, from the presiding officers. As if you talk about, as Mutlatsi spoke, meaningful public participation. What does that actually mean?
Yeah. Hello. Oh, yeah. I just want to add on that we have had a couple of interactions with the chair of the Justice Committee over a couple of bills that we've been making submissions to, and they've been very open and have taken our comments seriously, and we've seen the impact of or the value that our participation in the public process or participation in the public process is. And so, yeah, it definitely depends on the chair, because the Home Affairs Committee is not nothing like that, yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to add the issue, I think the central theme that's come out of our panel this afternoon, has been political culture. And so how public participation is dealt with in Parliament, how seriously it's taken, is due to the culture that the institution has. And maybe Home Affairs is Yunus Karim, pockets of excellence, but overall, public participation, like oversight, is treated like a tick box exercise. Have we put out the call for comment? But have they adequately and meaningfully dealt with the inputs received? I would like to highlight that last week, the Portfolio Committee on Women dealt with the Commission of Gender Inquiry public participation process for new commissioners that are being appointed. And a grouping of civil society organizations wrote to the committee to say that the Google form through which to submit comments is particularly limiting, and there was not enough information on the commissioners. And the committee chair dealt with that with the utmost disdain. She said, what more do these people want? And I think that that's the overriding culture in Parliament, unfortunately. The ANC likes to call itself the People's Parliament and People's Representatives, but there's a very warped understanding of what it means to represent the people.
Thank you so much. Apologies for running over time. I'm going to hand over to Naidoo.
Thank you very much to all the panelists. We are giving out our token of appreciation for coming here. You can come later for yours then. Thank you so much. If we can try to be back here by 2, it will be appreciated, because we will have caught up with time. Thank you so much. It's lunch.